Hello everyone, and thank you for your interest in this talk. My name is Hiba Ibrahim and I'm a PhD candidate in Applied Linguistics at York University in Canada. So in this presentation, I'll be sharing some findings about the potential of podcasting in promoting intercultural communicative competence among EFL learners. First, we'll be having a quick look at why podcasting and how it has been used or applied in second language acquisition. By highlighting some study findings, I will be briefly explaining why I thought of podcasting as one of the supplementary ICC activities in my study. I will then talk a bit more about the study and its findings and conclude with some implications for similar research in the future. So for the past few decades, we have witnessed a great shift in online education. Many have argued that e-learning is perceived as a rhetoric of lifelong learning and has its roots in a political discourse in which learners are seen as expert computer users. We also see the shift in the increasing number of governments and organizations turning to remote employment and the digital economy becoming the strategy for economic development. This rise in a global knowledge economy also comes with its requirements to access knowledges and skills for young professionals to compete globally. This requires, as Kidd argues, the need to reconceptualize education as an online activity, especially that the development of e-cultures through the use of emerging technologies and social media and the social learning aspect of online learning fit well within Vygotsky's constructivist theory, through which interaction and learning by social collaboration is prioritized. So what is podcasting? Benini defines podcasting as, quote, technology used to distribute, receive, and listen on demand to sound content produced by traditional editors, such as radio publishing houses, journalists, and educational institutions, as well as content created by independent radio producers, artists, and media amateurs, end quote. So this cultural shift in creating and sharing content online, enabled by new content sharing platforms such as podcasting, has ignited a culture of participatory of creativity online, as Sullivan describes it. This form of user-generated content offers flexibility and control over content creation and production, widening of knowledge creation and learning, and opportunities to engage in dialogue and collaborate through dialogue. As Sullivan and others argue, this form of online digital distribution of knowledge has allowed everyday professionals to take part in culture production, which has long been accepted as an exclusive activity for media corporations. And awareness of the complexity of multimodal texts, as we all know, and making meaning in the multimodal learning spaces have become critical in professional environments. These new channels of communication have offered new ways to work with audio, video, graphics, and text in one medium, in addition to offering learners with new opportunities to explore their legitimate membership in the communities they desire to belong to as young professionals. So since 2005, really, podcasting has caught attention as an educational resource with potential in enhancing the learning experience for students. For instance, on the Teachers Pay Teachers, there was a higher download rate of lesson plans that include podcasting between 2014 and 2015. On the iTunes U app, which established itself as an educational podcast provider, it had over 1 billion downloads between 2007 and 2013. Since podcasting involves the development of metalinguistic and semiotic practices along with digital literacies, language teaching and learning was identified as a potential beneficiary of its affordances, and literature has put forward activities and theory-based practice to explain how the use of podcasting can support second language acquisition, lifelong learning, and give learners access to authentic materials produced in the target language and culture. So if you look at podcasting and language learning research, for instance, Ellen and Gemelinda, most recently in 2021, actually integrated making and design concepts as complementary pedagogy in an advanced French writing course to lead some teaching activities through which students ideated, designed, and produced written and oral texts in French. These making and design concepts were, and I quote, were used to build learner awareness about meaning making in podcast personal narrative, to scaffold the collaborative process of creating a personal narrative, and to produce a podcast episode in French. It was actually noticed that students were able to create texts of different genres, demonstrate their understanding of form-meaning relationships, linguistic and stylistic choices, and why they were made. In addition, students established a sense of a writing community where they collaborated with others to write and exchange feedback on their personal narratives. Van Berg, for instance, also offers another example of what she calls the author's podcast in the English language classroom. In the series of podcasts, students produce episodes that feature authors they read about in class and in other readings as well. She also created podcasts with the authors of the books her class is reading to engage her students with the texts they are analyzing. Other studies also applied form-focused approaches to L2 vocabulary instruction through video podcasts, or as they called vodcasts, to identify the most efficient form-focused instruction-driven approach in tapping learners' lexical as well as comprehension gains. Students of German and French language courses in Duquesne and Lamika in 209 enjoyed the process of producing 3 podcasts and found the feedback they received on their pronunciation really helpful. However, data analysis of the podcast content, in addition to student surveys, revealed that students' pronunciation did not significantly improve in regard to accidentness or comprehensibility, concluding that the use of podcasts for this purpose probably needs to be longitudinal and involve in-class pronunciation practice. So coming to the context of the study, as we all know, the language culture nexus has been debated for decades. How can we teach culture in the language classroom, and how does intercultural competence look like? Are only 2 among many other questions practitioners pose when planning and designing their intercultural learning materials. From what has been discussed so far in this presentation, podcasting has great potential to be explored as a pedagogical tool for the development of intercultural competence in the language classroom. Designing the intercultural content of the podcast episodes allows efficient time for negotiation of meaning between learners. This can go beyond asking for clarification, rephrasing, and confirming to understanding how certain concepts and negotiating actually how certain concepts are perceived and or acted upon in different cultural contexts. Similarly, the dialogue nature of a podcast supports in-depth discussions of culture that should expand from talking fashion, festivals, and food to evaluating beliefs, values, and attitudes based on concrete evidence. By doing so, students can build critical intercultural awareness when given time and space to reflect on the target culture and their own. And with such an approach to utilizing technology for the creation of knowledge and perspective sharing, students can experience forms of social activism by owning their learning and their status as legitimate members of the target language community. So the podcasting data I'm talking about today is part of a study I conducted for my master's back in 2017. The podcast activity was part of the supplementary ICC materials I designed and taught as complementary pedagogy to the cultural content in the International English Language Teaching textbook in the study school. The study broadly explored the following questions. What impact does the ICC materials have on the participants' motivation towards their EFL learning? And which dimensions in Byram's ICC model do the designed materials develop? So as you can see here, the study was conducted in a private school in Amman, Jordan, with 13 female EFL students with mixed language abilities. The activities were taught over 4 weeks as an extracurricular activity. This was actually one of the limitations of the study, as it was really challenging to integrate the materials in the EFL syllabus due to time constraints. So as you could tell from the second research question, the task design was built on Byram's model of ICC. The materials were introduced as supporting materials to Module 7 in the English World 9 series published by Macmillan, whose main topic is travelogues. The materials introduce other aspects of intercultural experiences and observations one can encounter when traveling or learning about a new country and its people. Central to working on the activities was the integration of the knowledge and skills introduced in negotiating and evaluating historical events, social life, religious issues, multicultural communities, immigration, and making cultural assumptions in the native and target culture. And in this particular context, the target cultures were actually in the UK because the international textbook situates English learning within the UK. So for this particular study, I focused on the UK and its target culture as the main context besides Jordan. So the podcast activity was introduced as the last activity of week 2 in the study period. The Ostrich, which is a short story written by Layla Abul Ala, a story of an immigrant Sudanese woman who moves to London to live with her husband and goes through culture shock, was the first thing we started with that week. Students engaged in reading activities through which they discussed immigration, faith, and sense of belonging. Then they watched a short film on multiculturalism in the UK and related that to their experience of social groups and cultural communities in Jordan. For the podcast, students were divided in groups of 3 to produce a podcast episode. We ended up having 3 different groups. And in these episodes, they were expected to orient high school Jordanian students traveling for one term to study in the UK. The podcast episode was recommended not to be longer than 5 minutes, and students were to use the technology they felt comfortable with. All groups chose to use audio editing mobile phone apps such as Music Editor and WavePad Music and Audio Editor. Giving students the flexibility of choice was, first of all, due to time constraints, again, as there was no time to train them to use new technologies. But I also wanted them to focus mainly on the content in the first place, especially that it was the first time they engage in such an activity with technology and culture. Podcasting has also witnessed a shift towards using low-cost portable devices such as mobile phones, which contributed to the increasing popularity of podcasting as a teaching and learning resource in the classroom. So before starting the production process, students listened to 2 podcast episodes on travel to give them some examples on how the final product would sound like. Students were not advised to follow the same format, but we had a discussion on the different components of podcasting in small groups and also as a big group in class. In the following session, students joined their small groups to outline, design, and produce their podcast episodes. To help them stay on track, they worked with a progress checklist. Due to time constraints, I wasn't able, unfortunately, to provide formal feedback on their outlines, but students were encouraged to check in with me when they needed to. After sending their final products, we had a brief discussion on their podcasting experience, and students got the chance to ask each other questions on their podcast content as well. So what do the podcasts really tell us about the students' demonstration of ICC development? The data shows that the sharing factual knowledge about the target culture was the main focus of the podcast content. This is probably because the students indicated that they did not know much about the UK and its cultures before, and this was during the pre-study focus group discussions we had. However, some students tried to take the surface elements of culture into a deeper level of how their audience can navigate the new cultural context they will find themselves in. For instance, in one of the podcasts, students encouraged their audience to attend cultural festivals, which they identified as an opportunity to learn about the different communities in the UK and engage with others in conversations on how occasions have been celebrated differently across generations. In another podcast episode, students highlighted the importance of celebrating difference. And although it might cause a challenge for their audience at first, engaging with differences, whether they're in faith, gender, ethnic backgrounds, as they highlighted, this can impact their beliefs and practices, sometimes for the good and other times for the bad, as they described. During the outlining or designing phase, students challenged statements made by other group members. So they kind of challenged statements they made in their small group work. For instance, there was a tendency to reflect on phrases such as people in the UK or you will find, replacing them with some individuals in the UK and some of you might find, etc. This really marked as a shift in the language they've been using, especially when looking at heterostereotyping and autostereotyping. When you compare this to pre-study conversations in the focus group and also their performance in week 1 of the sessions and activities. However, when addressing challenges their audience might face in the new community, all groups addressed the challenge of living in a non-Muslim majority country. Almost all groups gave advice with the assumption that their audience members are all practicing Muslims. Caution about being negatively impacted by other faiths, not attending Islamic Center activities, and reminders of how to be an ambassador for Islam were some comments made about respecting one's own beliefs and practices while being away. Actually, when we look at this, there are a variety of factors that likely led to this cautious attitude towards others. First of all, they might be highly impacted by the short story they read, especially that the main character seems to be a practicing Muslim, and she found herself being challenged by practicing her faith newly in the UK. But also, when we look at the school where the study is conducted, they give special attention to Islamic studies, and the students frequently engage in school activities through which they're encouraged to celebrate their Muslim identity. Thus, they probably utilized a podcast activity as an opportunity to voice their respect and appreciation for their religious practices, especially in a situation they probably consider as threatening to losing this identity, and that is studying abroad and being exposed to non-Muslim practices. Another critical factor is the digital experiences of Islamophobia. Some of the participants discussed in the pre-study focus group. 2 participants, for instance, shared that they are engaged with other members of Facebook groups to talk about different cultural topics, that they were perceived as a modern, oppressed, and terrorist as Arab Muslims. Such difficult experiences, as we all know, in intercultural communication, and especially at this young age, need time for them to overcome, and obviously more activities to help learners suspend disbelief about other cultures. These activities are key to facilitate a process towards openness and critical evaluation. So when asked about their experience with podcasting, learners have shared positive feedback about how it supported their reflection and critical thinking, autonomous learning, collaboration skills, and their ability to express themselves freely. As you could see, most of the participants did not necessarily highlight ICC development or intercultural connection or communication or understanding, but rather the confidence and language development the podcast production process helped them with. And that's, again, probably because of the complex process of, developing ICC, and this is really a new topic and a new way to approaching culture to these students, so it definitely needs time for them to get the practice and keep it going. So what are some of the implications I personally had from the study? First of all, the data collected from the podcasting activity alone, although perceived positively by learners, revealed that the students' ICC did not significantly improve in terms of attitudes of openness and suspending disbelief about other cultures. For that, task types and sequencing will always remain a critical component in building intercultural learning experiences in the language classroom. Since we all know ICC is a complex construct to assess, pedagogy should be really put first when integrating ICC with technology and thinking of bringing technology to ICC learning, with a recognition that the study included activities before and after podcasting in this case, and students managed to demonstrate more openness and readiness to suspend belief about one's culture and disbelief about other cultures. It is still important to look at ICC development more holistically instead of singling out activities and make judgments about the progress students make. So again, it is a complex process and it does need time. Also, it's really, to me at least, still unfortunate to see limited discussions on religion and the role it plays in not only shaping cultural beliefs and practices, but also intercultural awareness about self and other and social relationships. The notion that religious considerations are incompatible with the role of professionals is a mischaracterization of what societal roles those learners will fulfill in their future. As Zahrana in 29 illustrates in her chapter in the Sage Handbook of Intercultural Competence, examining how religious texts teach dialogue and work with difference can be a valuable approach to understanding intercultural competence across cultures, but also to developing positive attitudes and critical skills among learners, skills they need, obviously, in professional environments today, especially with more remote work now emerging. And finally, research on podcasting for the development of intercultural competence is still needed, especially with the utilization of virtual exchange more and more these days. For instance, we see more integration of a variety of emerging technologies across cultures in designing tasks for the exchange. And perhaps this could be one of the virtual learning spaces that we could see more reports on the use of podcasting and how it can be utilized for ICC development for learners. So these are some of the references that you can refer to at your own pace. And I would like to thank you all for watching, and I look forward for our discussion in August. Thank you.